Hey, we're live. Hey, everybody, it's Friday.
Hey!
What's up? What's up? What's up? What's up? All right. So look at Scott. Look at Scott in the jacket, the new studio. This looks awesome.
It
This is
does.
a big business.
Man,
The team here has done a great job with this new set. I love it.
Heck yeah.
Dustin, well done.
It looks great. I like it a lot. I'm overdue for a studio remodel. I've been in the same setup since history of CMMC, CS2 virtual. It's been a couple of years since I've changed. I think I changed the light in the background and our cardboard play button on the wall. Oh God, I'm backwards. Cardboard play button on the wall for like 5,000 subs. That's about it.
All you got to do is move to Huntsville and you can use this studio all the time.
There you go. There you go. All right.
Studio,
let us know in chat. Should I move to the great state of Alabama? Anyways, we're all here together again, like we do every Friday, live Q&A, taking questions, CUIHotline.org. You can fill out the form. You can call the number. You can let us know in chat if you have questions. We got a big queue of stuff that we didn't get to from some previous episodes. But first off, we'll start with some housekeeping. Daniel Acreage edition. New podcast alert, MDA supplier event. He's everywhere. You know him, you love him. Daniel, tell the people where they can find more Daniel.
Yeah, absolutely. So we just launched a new podcast called That CMMC Show. So we're going to be interviewing all sorts of people. We had Matt from Align, a C3PAO. We talked about how assessments are going, what like relevant controls are for security protection assets, how to know if you failed or not in assessment, little things like that. We've got some pretty good people lined up over the next few weeks. We have Larry Great. We're going to talk about operational technology, cybersecurity, and how specialized assets fit into that, and some good recommendations and best practices. We'll have Ryan Bonner on the show talking about what CUI may or may not apply to you. So we've got a fun little lineup. And if you have anybody that you'd like to hear from or any topics you'd like covered, feel free to reach out on LinkedIn. You can like and subscribe on the YouTube channel for Summit 7 and the podcast on Spotify and Apple Music. So
awesome. Yeah, and these are going to be occasional. I think they're going to be every few weeks or so, just depending as they come up, mostly interview based. So it's going to be a bunch of awesome information. So you can check out that first episode. I just bumped into Matt at Colorado Springs yesterday at CS2 Live, Colorado Springs. Matt's awesome. It was a great event. We had, I don't know, maybe 30, 40 people there. And it was an awesome event because it sort of turned into like a forum style conversation rather than just sort of like a top down presentation thing where people were, it was awesome. It was awesome to hear people's experiences, their questions, helping each other out, making connections. So it was a great event. We're going to have another CS2 Live in Dallas, another Summit 7 Live in Dallas. We'll have another Summit 7 Live in Tampa. CS2 is coming up in like 50 days in the beginning of May at CS2 Reston. We'll be at Seek West also in May in Vegas, which is going to be a blast. Scott, you're going to be all over the place doing all kinds of stuff. So
coast to coast.
Yeah, you've been on the road now for a while, going everywhere. So
yeah, it's been a crazy time of travel. Lots going on in the ecosystem, and we're all just out there, trying to help out and make sure that people understand what's going on and how they can help themselves. That's a big part of it, is helping yourself.
Well, Scott, I have something I need help with. Can you please help me understand what's going on?
God.
What is going on with the CPCSC program? We did a whole podcast on it this week, and I still don't know.
Yeah, exactly. You and Jason did a great job with that. But man, I feel bad for the DIB. It's just not good. Having to deal with 80171 R2 and R3 and two completely different, third-party assessment situations with no kinds of reciprocity. Talk about raising costs for the DIB. If you're doing, work, for Canadian contracts and U.S.-based contracts, it's just not a good look. Not good. I'm very frustrated by it because it didn't have to be that way. It didn't have to be that way. Right now there's no reciprocity of any kind, and this isn't just going to be a Canada issue. This is going to be an issue, for UK. This is going to be an issue for Israeli. I mean, all these companies that do work across, the US DIB as well as their local, their home countries and other European countries. And now, if DOD and these countries don't get together, we're going to end up having, a half dozen or more situations, certifications that are going to have to be done so that you can continue doing the work that you need to be doing. I'm all for securing the data, right? The data needs to be secured, but we do not need to verify 6 different times from 6 different countries using 6 different teams that we're doing, that we're doing the right thing. That's just not necessary.
And I go back, Scott, FedRAMP. US has access to FedRAMP clouds. Not every country has access to FedRAMP clouds. So if other countries have to follow 32 CFR, the way that it's written, they have to do it primarily on-prem, which nobody
wants to do. I mean, if you have a Canadian or a UK company today, if you don't have a US subsidiary, a US address, you can't get access to the platform.
Nope.
The platform's needed. It's just they've got to work the international aspect of this whole thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, and really, for those of you who are not aware, the crux of the issue is that the Canadian Program for Cybersecurity Certification, their CMMC program, is specifying and verifying NIST SP 800-171 Revision 3, whereas the US CMMC program verifies NIST SP 800-171 Revision 2. And thanks to a class deviation that was issued about a year ago, US contractors to comply with DFARS 7012 and their contracts comply with 171 Revision 2. There's quite a sizable delta between Revision 2 and Revision 3. There's a bunch of other variables that we don't know about, even if they were on the same baseline. Is their scoping guidance the same? Will their organizationally defined parameters be the same? Good example that somebody messaged me this morning was in 800-171 Revision 3, the ODP for the type of encryption that you need to use is not specified currently as FIPS validated encryption. It's widely believed that the Department of Defense will specify FIPS validated crypto as the requirement when they move to Rev 3. What if Canada doesn't do that? You have 2 different encryption standards. Can they be reciprocal? Nobody knows.
Yeah, I mean, what happens with if all the ODPs get set differently, right? How do we deal with that? Do you high watermark everything? I guess is the way you deal with it. But it's
now I'll say this: some of the Canadians on LinkedIn, love you guys, got a little sensitive whenever we were pointing out there's a gap here. We're not saying it's anybody's fault, although I'm sure we could say that it's a particular group of people's fault. That's not the point. The point is there needs to be reciprocity between the 2 programs, because some people were saying, well, this can't possibly affect that many companies. We have clients that have this problem, that are facing this problem. So I don't know if that's just luck of the draw, but I think there's a lot more companies that this will cause issues for than not, right?
Yeah, I mean, our Canadian friends are a bit sensitive these days with everything going on. And so that's completely understandable. But this isn't a Canadian thing. This isn't a US thing. This is just a communication thing.
Yes.
And communication obviously failed between the US and Canada on this specific topic. And this was something that was well before the current administration. So I don't think this is one where we can point the finger at the current administration for this problem.
Yeah. All righty. Okay. Well, yeah, you guys check that out and check out the podcast, and then we'll go from there. Lots of strong opinions around the program, but we got to get to reciprocity one way or another. So, all right, let's see here. All right, Daniel, talk about FedRAMP. Talking about fun stuff. Is it even worth it to do FedRAMP equivalency? What is FedRAMP equivalency? What's going on here?
Yeah. So in talking with Matt on the podcast last week, really just kind of brought up, like, is it even worth it? And the amount of sunk time it costs for an assessor to validate the body of evidence, and the fluctuation on being able to maintain that compliance for not only just point in time, but also from the time of your assessment, it's just becoming not worth it to use equivalency products. It's too risky. You can obviously do it, and there's a path forward to do it from an assessment perspective, but it's just high corporate risk, because you don't know at that point in time when they're reviewing and validating the body of evidence if it's going to check the box or not, right? Yeah. And right now, it's just not worth it.
And we saw that happen. We saw that happen where people were using solutions that for other people a week or 2 before they were fine, and then suddenly it was an issue. And you can love it or hate it or think that that's reasonable or unreasonable. When it comes down to it, if you're a contractor relying on it, there's uncertainty there.
Oh, it's certainly. Go ahead. Sorry, Daniel.
Well, I talked to 3 companies in the course of a week that failed their DIBCAC high assessment because they were using FedRAMP moderate equivalency tool, and that tool had lost its equivalency. 3 companies.
That's crazy. I mean, it's certainly something that you have to have the conversation with your prospective C3PAOs as you are interviewing, what C3PAO you're going to go with for your assessment, what the view is on FedRAMP equivalency if you're dealing with it, what their view of that is. It's certainly something I would make sure I was asking.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. All righty, let's see here. Okay, so the regulatory freeze. Y'all remember this? From January 20th, there were a bunch of executive orders that were signed, and it was, it was what it was. And one of those executive orders was called regulatory freeze on pending actions or some such thing like that. We did an entire podcast on the regulatory freeze memo because a lot of people on LinkedIn, rightly or wrongly, said, oh, there's a freeze on rulemaking. There's a freeze on regulations. CMMC is a regulation. Therefore, CMMC is frozen. Checkmate, CMMC. And that is not at all how that process works, as we talked about in the podcast. Regulatory freezes are now apparently a routine part of the administrative state every time there's a new administration. All it does is say that rules that are pending publication or rules that are pending going into effect will be reviewed by the incoming administration's team rather than by the outgoing administration's team. Regulatory review in that way is still the same as regulatory review at any other time. It just says we have continuity with the incoming administration for regulatory review. This has been happening now for every administration going back for like 20 or 30 years. There's a regulatory freeze memo that you can find a record of going all the way back. We talk about it in the podcast. Not unusual. Same thing happened in 2020. Every time there's been an administration change, it has happened. And it wouldn't affect CMMC because the 32 CFR rule that went into effect on December 16th of 2024 did just that. It went into effect. It is a black and white regulation. If you Google 32 CFR 170, you will see what was the rule is now in the Code of Federal Regulations as a regulation. So it's not going to unwind things that are already in effect. The other rule that we're waiting on, the 48 CFR rule, that's the part that takes the language of CMMC policy and puts it into your specific contracts via specific contract clause language, which contract clauses are themselves regulations. So they too have to go through this whole process of rulemaking. That rule is currently in the process of adjudicating public comments that they received when they published their rule several months ago. So it's not going up for regulatory review now for probably maybe another several weeks. It certainly wasn't going to be going up for regulatory review anytime in January. That just doesn't move that quickly. Once it goes up for regulatory review, it will just go through the review process like every other rule has to go through the process. So the regulatory freeze memo would have no effect on the CMMC program. So now here we are 60 days later, and the 48 CFR rule is still working its way through the process, should be up for regulatory review sometime soon. 32 CFR CMMC is still in effect. Companies are still, oh no, we don't have our banner. Companies are still going through their CMMC assessment, 22 of which are Summit 7 clients. So we know that this process is still happening. And so, yeah, the freeze memo was fake news. It meant nothing in terms of its impact to CMMC. The freeze is now over. And so if you come across anybody on LinkedIn or otherwise saying, oh, there's a freeze on the rule, not true, politely remind them and send them my way so I could maybe more forcefully remind them because it's very annoying.
So today was the day, right? March 21st.
Today was the end of the day, March 21st. I had heard that they were pulling the freeze early. I think there's like 10 or 12, maybe more rules on the OMB dashboard right now from various federal agencies. So this process has still been occurring. It wasn't like they used the freeze memo as some sort of veil to stop all rulemaking.
Right.
But, you know, that requires like digging into the OMB dashboard and stuff like that, which most people don't do. So, yeah, as of now, we're 60 days past. Rules are being posted. Regulatory review is going on like normal. There's no more transition period between the previous OMB and the current OMB. There's a director, there's a team, there's all that stuff. And yeah, we're back to rulemaking like normal. So that was a fun 60 days. If anybody waited 60 days to see what was going on as a result of the CMMC rule and the freeze memo, you wasted 60 days of time. And yeah, so you should get started as soon as possible.
Yeah, the
So
freeze
put on your
is here
wizard.
to Huntsville.
Yeah, no joke. It's freezing outside. Putting on your wizard hat for a second here, Jacob. Katie's DoD CIO. I'm assuming she's going to push 48 CFR submission to OMB OIRA fairly quickly. What do you think? When's that going to happen? Do you think? Is this like a week out? Is this a month out? I still
am sticking with our conservative estimate based off of historic average timelines. So there's a lot of reasons why the rule could go faster than average. It's smaller, narrower scope, fewer public comments, simpler rule. Katie Arrington is in there snapping necks and getting people back to work and doing what she does. There's a lot of reasons why the rule could go faster than average. I would say that the Big Brother 32 CFR CMMC rule went 30% faster than the historic average. So even as large as that rule was, I would say the longest that the tinier rule, the 48 CFR rule, would take would be as long as its Big Brother took. And that would have the rule getting published in like June, which isn't that far away. We're at the end of March now. So you're talking 60, 90-ish days before we would see the published rule. That's the conservative estimate based off of historic averages and how long the other related, much larger rule took. I would not be surprised at all to wake up any day now and see that the rule has moved into regulatory review because of those other factors. But we generally try to estimate conservative rulemaking timelines around here. So I would say the conservative estimate would be June. The more aggressive estimate would be any day. And that could absolutely happen. But I just don't have the numbers to say that. There's reasons to believe it could happen. And if it does, people will certainly hear about it from here, LinkedIn, the podcast, so on and so forth. But I'm still sticking with June. If we're like, if I get to bet $5, I'm betting June. So
conservative estimates are always best in these kinds of things. We definitely don't want to be a sky is falling type outlet, if you will.
Yeah. Wait, is today the first day of spring? Wait, no way. Is that true? Is that true, Brad? The freeze memo is over on the first day of spring. How poetic. Is that true?
Call it out.
Yeah. Vince, it would be for publication in June. So we should see it move into regulatory review prior to that, but it would be published in June. And obviously take these with a grain of salt. There's no real way to know how long individual rules take. As far as I know, Scott, when we did the math on all those rules from 2009, it was the first time ever that anybody ever actually took the data out of the OMB database and ran those numbers. We should write a paper or something, see if somebody would publish it, because I don't think anybody's ever actually done that.
Data-driven rulemaking. There's the
There you go. There you go.
It's a little bathroom read for you.
Let's get into some questions. All right. Can I use NIST Handbook 162 instead of NIST Special Publication 800-171A? No, you cannot. Yeah, you cannot do that. So for those of you who don't know, NIST handbooks are similar to special publications. There's not quite as many. NIST Handbook 162 was a document written by the great and powerful Pat Toth, who has since retired, as a part of the NIST Manufacturing Extension Partnerships program to help translate and demystify DFARS cybersecurity requirements for defense manufacturers, right? And so we had at the time NIST SP 800-171, but there was no 171A. And so people said, how do I know if I've implemented the requirements? What do I do here? So Pat took it upon herself, inspired by 853A, to write a handbook to explain what was going on. So if you look through Handbook 162, the first thing that you'll notice, there's a big banner on the front page now that says this has been rescinded. This is not official guidance. Do not use this. But for reference, for curiosity, for expanding your understanding of how this stuff works, it's very interesting to see how we went from 162 to a more formalized version of 171A. In a lot of ways, I wish that 171A was written in the manner and style of Handbook 162, but it isn't as granular and as detailed as the verification procedures in 171A. So blending the two would be cool. Using maybe Handbook 162 as a style guide for 171A would be pretty interesting. If you're interested in learning more about that particular detail, check out CS2. Virtual registration is open I'll be giving a presentation on this exact topic, how to make 171A more efficient and effective and easier to use. But as of right now, Handbook 162 is not the authoritative guidance for evaluating whether or not your controls and requirements in SP 800-171 have been implemented. There's a lot of people who discover Handbook 162 and they go, this is great, this is more readable, all that stuff. You will not be able to calculate an accurate score. You won't be able to have sufficient assurance. You won't be preparing yourself according to the kinds of questions you'll be asked under an external assessment in accordance with 171A. Still interesting for a weekend read, but not authoritative guidance. You cannot use it in place of 171A.
And I just looked it up just because I was curious. Deprecated September 23rd, 2022. So it's actually been deprecated for quite some time, to your point, Vincent.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. All righty. Let's see here. Do I really have to create individual training for every role in the company?
Yeah, so I had a question this week. It was a really great question. And the individual was asking, when you're looking at security awareness training in NIST 800-171, it says that you need to create role-based training for your individuals in your organization, right? And so the person I was talking to was kind of under the assumption like, oh, I need to create finance training. I need to create HR training. I need to create very, very, very individualized training. And one of the conversations I had with him is like, one thing to do, instead of thinking it on like a departmental basis, think of it as a role basis, right? Privileged and non-privileged access, right? From a role perspective. And so when you're doing security awareness training, and we do this here at Summit 7, Scott, right? So it's like we have non-privileged access training that we do, that the whole company actually does. And then we have requirements that anyone accessing and having privileged access goes through and gets additional training through Security Plus or an equivalent or higher certification. So when we're going through these requirements, you don't have to be as microscopic in your training from a departmental perspective. More kind of privilege and non-privilege is a good way to think about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's really about, 800-171, CMMC, it's all about data. It's about the data. How do these individuals interact on a day-to-day basis with the data? You have non-privileged access, you have those that maybe access FCI, you maybe have a group that access CUI, and then there is additional training over and above if you have individuals who have clearances. And, there's specific training for cleared individuals that they have to do. And then there is even potentially, there's even training that goes, depending on what type of clearance you may have, going further deeper into the cleared world, there's other kinds of training that you have to do. So it's all about data and data access in the positions they have, and just build it around those and you should be fine.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
I couldn't imagine, by the way, could you imagine, Scott, building individual departmental training for CUI for every department?
For each job description.
That'd be wild.
Let's see here. Okay. All right. This has been an interesting conversation I've had with some people back and forth on LinkedIn recently. It's actually the reason why I gave the presentation all the way back in 2021 called Fuzzy Math. The entire premise of that presentation at CS2 San Diego was, did you know that 171A exists and you have to use it?
So, by the way, a lot of people today still don't know it exists, so they might need to.
Correct. Yeah, absolutely. So, but it's probably the most common thing that we have stressed over the years is that 171A is really what you have to orient yourself to. I was just in Colorado Springs yesterday at the event, and I was saying 171A is the thing you gotta associate, you gotta orbit around, especially if you're going to outsource services. Because if you're paying money for things, how do you know that you're getting what you're paying for? And ironically, the questions that you yourself would ask are the same questions that the assessors would ask. How do you know that the controls are implemented? How do I know that what I've paid you for is being done? So maybe there's more in common between the contractors and the assessors than they initially believe. But it's a valid question. Where does it say that I have to actually use NIST SP 800-171A? Because NIST SP 800-171 doesn't really talk about 171A, and DFARS 7012 doesn't even mention the existence of SP 800-171A. So where does it go? The primary place, one of many places that you could find it, is in CUI Notice 2020-04 from the Information Security Oversight Office back in the day when they were ripping and raring with guidance and town halls and all kinds of cool stuff, because they are the office inside of the National Archives and Records Administration, who is responsible for the federal-wide CUI program. And so they gave a notice that says, we're providing guidance on assessing security requirements for CUI within non-federal information systems in unclassified environments. Exactly the topic at hand. And if you scroll down here, they say when any entity assesses compliance with the security requirements of NIST SP 800-171, they must use NIST SP 800-171A procedures to evaluate the effectiveness of the tested controls. 171A is the primary and authoritative guidance on assessing compliance with SP 800-171. If that were not enough, and you want it to be very centric to the DoD's implementation of all of this federal guidance, then you can find it in the CMMC regulation several times. Specifically, and this is if you Google, this is not the rule, this is the regulation itself. You can find it in the rule, of course. But you can just Google 32 CFR 170 and then Control F for 800-171A, and you'll find it in here 13 times. Specifically, Level 2 certification assessments of the OSC. It's the same language for Level 1, same language for Level 2 self-assessments. An authorized or accredited C3PAO must perform a Level 2 certification assessment in accordance with NIST SP 800-171A, dated June of 2018. If you look in the assessment guides for CMMC on the CIO website, between the Level 1 assessment guide, the Level 2 assessment guide, and the Level 3 assessment guide, 800-171A is mentioned 490 times. It is mentioned numerous times in the DoD Procurement Toolbox Cybersecurity Frequently Asked Questions. And so, yes, you must use 171A for the assessment of the requirements in NIST SP 800-171 if you find anyone, especially anyone charging you money, saying that you can just simply check yes, no against the 110 requirements in NIST SP 800-171, run away. Immediate red flag. There's debate about to which degree can a company completely satisfy all of the 320 criteria in 171A for you. But the bare bones starting first base Level 1, step 0 is, are they aware of 171A? Have they mapped their services to 171A? Does their compliance tool that they're charging you money for allow you to calculate a score based off of 800-171A, not just off of the requirements in 171? So yes, you must use it whenever you are evaluating your implementations.
Yeah, Vincent brings up, good point here about DODAM and the 32 CFR rule pointing out 171A. If I'm not mistaken, I believe the CAP points out 171A. I mean, it's everywhere, right?
Yeah.
Look at basically any document that talks about assessment for 800-171 or for CMMC, and it points to 171A.
Yeah, and this is the nice part about this CMMC assessment guides, is that they take the two separate documents and they make them one document, which is the table stakes, in my opinion, of what NIST should do with 171 and 171A. One of my main recommendations over the years that they haven't done. So it's a nice thing that they did it in the assessment guides themselves.
And it's just a little footnote in the actual NIST 800-171 document. Footnote number 11 on page 3.
Yeah.
Hey, use 171A. It's like they're whispering it in the document. It's like, guys,
because to NIST, right,
a little bit more, right? It's like
they wrote high level outcome based engineering requirements for what they assumed would be an audience of engineers who would already implicitly know that you have to take general system wide requirements and decompose them down into actual verifiable criteria to prove that you've met the requirement. As it turns out, no one in the audience for 171 knows that.
Yeah.
So they won't do that, and they won't know to go look for those things unless you put it in the guide. It's a long-standing frustration. I love a lot of the stuff that the guys at NIST do, but they got that one wrong, and we'll keep fighting for them to blend it together. Also something that I'll be talking about at CS2 during my presentation.
Man, the feed is flowing with 171A questions and comments.
I love it.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. All right. So let's get into a little bit of the backlog and then we'll jump into chat here. This was an interesting one, Daniel, and I don't know if I've sat on a call with you for medical providers doing DoD contracting work, but somebody was asking about what are the challenges that medical providers face with CMMC, if there are any unique challenges to them. When does PHI become CUI, if at all?
Yeah, so this is interesting. So looking inside of the actual registry, you see multiple different kind of categories there for privacy information, right? You see health information, military personnel records. You have kind of a slurry of things. And especially if you're supporting the VA, very likely you're going to potentially come in possession of these, right? If you're actually on the medical professional front, not necessarily building VA hospitals, but actually treating patients, right? And so when you're looking at the CUI categories, the biggest hurdle that we've started to encounter is if you are processing, storing, or transmitting these records, a lot of which would fall under and constitute CUI because of the VA and the people that they're supporting, then you've got to look for electronic medical health record platforms that are FedRAMP now. And so when you start kind of going down the list, there's just not a ton of options for you to be able to easily process, store, and transmit those records, right? And so now you're relying heavily on the VA to provide those systems, right? Versus you, or you have to come up with creative ways to meet HIPAA requirements as well as meet CUI requirements simultaneously, right? And so it is like threading a needle for people in the healthcare space supporting the DoD, right? And military personnel, either retired or active duty inside of the DoD. So it's difficult. Long story short, specifically read, go in the NARA registry, go in the DoD CUI registry, and read the definition of medical records and military personnel records and so forth and so on, and just see if you are, kind of in scope for that type of information. Pray to God that you're not, and then start looking for a lot of providers that can support you both on the HIPAA and on the CUI side.
So what have you, you've been in some conversations on this, Daniel. I don't know that I've actually had that many conversations on this specific topic, but, I am familiar with electronic health record, systems. Are there any out there that are FedRAMPed right now? I mean, the two biggest ones out there, at least to my knowledge, are Epic and Cerner, right?
Yep.
Are either one of those FedRAMPed at the moment?
Not that I've found. I'll look them up on the FedRAMP marketplace now, but back several months ago when this was a little bit more of a hotbed topic, quite honestly, I didn't see either of those FedRAMP. So let me take a look at the marketplace while we're on the call here and see if either Epic is not and Cerner is not. So neither of them are actually on the marketplace. So again, it becomes very difficult. A lot of people are just like, we'll move to the Microsoft Gov Cloud, we'll move to a compliant ERP system or host it ourselves. But when you start getting into the medical world of things, there's just not a lot of forerunners or pioneers in the software SaaS space that have really taken that by the reins, which is shocking to me. You would think that one of those large, massive organizations would have pursued FedRAMP years ago, quite honestly.
Right.
Epic is pretty surprising to me. They're everywhere and they're huge. So you would think that they would do it. But yeah, I mean, we see it all the time. This reminded me. So it's a live edit to the questions here, because I remember this from last week from what you told me, Daniel, from a call, maybe or maybe not, depending on who's listening to the call. Let's just say our MSP migrated us to the wrong cloud. They migrated them to the wrong one.
I hate to tell you this has only happened one time, but the conversations I've had over the last 3-ish years, I think it's happened about 4 times, 3 to 4 times is my current count, where they migrated them to a GCC cloud, not GCC high, because they thought that there was only one Gov cloud. And some of these organizations have processed, stored, and transmitted and accessed export control data during that duration, and their MSP migrated them to the wrong platform altogether. Now, here's a little fun fact. The contractor, the customer would actually be liable to making sure that they're using the appropriate tool sets if you look at DFARS 7012, but the MSP is definitely liable in some sort of civil suit if there would have been a violation, right? Because I have some people that have told me the invoices stated they were in the Gov High Cloud for implementation and licensing, and it was that far off. So trust but verify, isn't that what they say? it's like trust to an extent, but with the type of sensitive data you're working with, please, even if you're a small business, do everything you can to verify that they're actually putting you in the right place.
Yeah, and one of the best ways to do that is to look at the endpoints of the services. Where
Yes.
where are those services pointing to? It might not be easy for a lot of smaller businesses that don't have dedicated IT staffs to understand exactly where to find that data. Maybe we can put that in some notes somewhere or something. What the actual endpoints are for GCC and Azure Government, just to make it a little bit easier for people to find.
I'll make a note of that. We'll put it in the show notes as well in YouTube. And Johnny, man, it's like my man just set me up for the next answer I wanted to give, and he just brought the question to us. Do you mind popping Johnny Messer's question up?
Yeah, let's see.
Because believe it or not, I have this on my screen right now. This is a riveting conversation.
All right. So Johnny says, quick question. This is my first time joining, but I heard a statement a couple of days ago that AWS East-West is configured for CUI. I looked and it is on FedRAMP Marketplace. Is this an option versus AWS.gov?
So there's two kind of components of it. I'm gonna answer your question and then follow it up with a very common misconception. So yes, it's in the FedRAMP Marketplace. However, this is where it gets very fun and confusing. The commercial instance doesn't meet the full flow down requirements of DFARS 7012 for the incident response. That's why they created a GovCloud. Same thing with export control data, right? AWS has a GovCloud to support export control data and to meet the entirety of your DFARS 7012 flow down. If you look at the cap and you look at what an assessor should actually be looking at, it does not call out the requirement of incident response that an assessor would validate that, right? It just calls out FedRAMP. So it's going to be interesting. You'll have a C3PO that will assess you for FedRAMP cloud tools and make sure they are a moderate, equivalent, or higher, but they will not look at incident response. So you could use a FedRAMP moderate or equivalent or higher cloud like AWS and commercial and not actually be meeting all of the contractual obligations that you have. So it gets very nuanced when we're talking about this. The second piece of that I wanted to kind of tag on to this, because this is a very common question and misconception. A lot of software vendors, SaaS tools and things like that, will host their products on a GovCloud, an AWS GovCloud, in Azure GovCloud, right? And they think that they are inheriting their FedRAMP authorization for their application just because they're running in a FedRAMP environment. This is on the FedRAMP FAQ. So this is the Bible when it comes to what we're talking about on if something actually is FedRAMP authorized or not. And so when you're looking at this, and I want nobody to be, confused by this, if the application itself is not in the FedRAMP marketplace, but you have a vendor claiming they are FedRAMP because they are in a GovCloud, they are wrong. Hard stop. And this is from the FedRAMP FAQ, right? If they're using and hosting a SaaS tool, they do not inherit FedRAMP authorization. They do inherit a lot of controls that are required for FedRAMP, like physical security and things like that they can use in their own SSP, but that does not automatically make them authorized. So please make sure that when you're going through this process, validate that the cloud is meeting the FedRAMP requirement, meeting DFARS 7012 requirement, and meeting export control if you have it. And then if you are using an application that is hosted in the GovCloud, and that vendor says, we're good because we're in the GovCloud, they are wrong, and you will fail an assessment because of it. They have to be in the FedRAMP marketplace, or they have to produce and go through a 3PAO audit and be able to show equivalency. So I just want to kind of call that out there because that comes out so much. Jacob, you and I were on a call today about it. And so be aware, do not be hoodwinked when it comes to CMMC compliant cloud tools that are not in the FedRAMP marketplace, because chances are they are actually not compliant for your needs.
Yep. Yeah, it's sort of it's the next level boss to when people say we need help with CMMC and the cloud app says we do 800.171. The control set is the control set in the FedRAMP moderate baseline, and they go, well, we're hosted in a FedRAMP authorized cloud, and you're like, well, is your application in the marketplace? And so there's definitely this nesting doll of relationships here to be aware of.
And this is what's kind of a little bit of a bummer, right? A C3PO will probably pass a bunch of people because they're using FedRAMP moderate clouds for their own consumption, right? I'm not talking about that SaaS app thing that we just talked about. And they will pass successfully. However, you're still not in full contract. You're still not following the requirements of your contract with DFARS 7012. So in my opinion, there's a big disconnect with the cap not including the full DFARS 7012 requirements.
Yep.
Because it leads people down a road to actually still be in non-compliance, but being able to achieve a CMMC certification.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for stopping by, Johnny. You said your first time stopping by, so I hope to see you in the future. It's a good question.
Yeah, great question.
All right.
You got me all riled up, Johnny.
Nothing gets them riled up like FedRAMP questions. So, all right, Jonathan, frequent flyer here on the show. Thanks for stopping by. He says, what guidance would you provide to a subsidiary subject to CMMC when it is part of a larger group that is not subject to CMMC, but relies on the group's policies? How should the subsidiary structure its documentation to ensure compliance while leveraging existing policy? Would implementing a dedicated documentation framework and a shared responsibility matrix, considering that the group has a managed service provider, be the best approach in your opinion?
Yeah, I would say, very clear documentation, very clear references in your documentation to where you call out to the larger organization and where you are modifying the larger organization's procedures specifically to map to 801.71a for the requirement set. And then if you've got and this is something that Daniel and I have talked about quite a bit as well, is, even if you are doing things, within an organization and you're not leveraging an external service provider, it is still a good idea to build a shared responsibility matrix of who within your organization is doing what for each, assessment objective within 801.71a. Because you don't want to get into a situation where you're sitting in an assessment and you have two different groups within your organization pointing at each other saying, you're doing that. No, you're doing that. You do not want that in an assessment. So have an SRM built out with each organization within your team, division, however your organization's broken down, and make sure that everybody knows who's covering what across the board when you get into that assessment.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so here's a little wrinkle to that then. So Jonathan corrected his previous question. What happens if you have a subsidiary and they're relying on the group as their MSP rather than does that change anything in your estimation here in terms of what should go down?
Most people, when we're talking like with holding companies that have a bunch of opcos or universities with a shared services division for their regulated research, right? Every single one of them are taking the position of treating the shared services component as an external service provider. Yeah. And this definitely lessens the burden a good bit on subsidiaries in your example. Which is great. They don't require a certification as an ESP, technically on paper, although I still think it would be good for them to go through one. So the burden is not necessarily as heavy per se, but definitely having the shared responsibility matrix down to a RACI level, right? Roles and responsibilities, put people's names next to controls and assessment objectives. But yes, in the models that we have seen for the past few years, treating your shared services as an ESP at your parents level is a very, very, very common approach, and make sure they are willing to participate and make sure that they're using compliant clouds to do all of your monitoring and management. Because that's a very common misstep that we've seen, is that we've seen organizations with thousands and thousands and thousands of users and 50 to 100 opcos, right? And they're using tool sets all on the commercial side that do not meet the requirement, and those tools process, store, and transmit CUI. And so yes, I think using them as an ESP, as an MSP, if you will, having all the appropriate documentation, validating that they're able to meet all the cloud requirements as part of that, and personship requirements if you have export control, is definitely the way to go.
Yeah, awesome. All right, we got a message on the hotline. Everybody, somebody called the number, so we should have the lights flash in the background. So we got a real phone call.
With the new 171 Revision 3. Those of us who have spent several years working to revision 2, which revision are we going to get audited on? Do we have to start all over again with revision 3? It looks really totally different. So what are we going to be audited on in 2025? Revision 2 or Revision 3? Thank you.
All right. Well, there you
Are
go.
they in Canada? No, I'm just kidding.
As long as you're not in Canada, this is a very easy question to ask.
Yeah. Well, it's an easy question as long as you get it done in 2025, right?
That's right.
Yeah, absolutely. So
Rev 2 is the answer, by the way,
Yeah,
at
Rev
least
2.
for now. And until CMMC 2. or 3.0 comes out and they incorporate Rev 3 as part of it, everything is hard coded to Rev 2. DFARS 7012 has class deviations in it for Rev 2. CMMC and the CAP is all pointing to Rev 2 of the publication. Now you can start kind of the journey towards Rev 3 if you've gotten Rev 2 buttoned up, for sure. Obviously, you want to try and be ahead of the curve. But yeah, from an assessment approach, the CMMC assessment process states very clearly it will be revision 2 that you will be assessed against. That's a great question.
But back to the point, if you're doing work in Canada or if you're looking at 2026 or 2027, I would certainly be looking really, really hard at revision 3.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you want the official black and white policy answer for why you should implement 171 Rev 2, not 171 Rev 3, and why you will be assessed against 171 Rev 2, not 171 Rev 3, it is this memo known as a class deviation from last year that says specifically to all contract workforce in the DoD, effective immediately, contract officers shall use the attached version of DFARS 7012 in place of the current language, the deviation clause. So this updated language that goes in place of what's in your contract says those who are subject to DFARS 7012 will comply with NIST Special Publication 800-171 Revision 2 instead of the version of 800-171 in effect at the time the solicitation is issued, which is what DFARS 7012 clause language currently says. So that's why you don't need to implement Rev 3. And then the CMMC policy all talks about 171 Rev 2. We don't think that that will be updated to, you could call it CMMC 3.0, if you will, in the future for, I would say, 2 to 3-ish years, depending on the rulemaking, is the conservative way to think about it. However, things can happen. So, there could be an interim final rule that could dramatically accelerate the rulemaking process. So it's not outside the realm of possibility that some of the people who are waiting to go through their assessments later on in 2026 could get caught up in this issue. So it pays to get started now because 171 Rev 2 is smaller, it's cheaper. In a lot of ways, it's a little more straightforward, depending on who you ask. There's a lot of solutions that are designed for it. There's a lot of assessments that have gone through against Rev 2. So you have to do it sooner, but it might be easier. But as of right now, policy is Rev 2. Policy won't be updated to Rev 3 for some time. But keep coming to Q&A. Check out the podcast. Follow us on LinkedIn and everything, because we will certainly be shouting it from the mountaintops as soon as we hear any indication that things are being updated to different revisions. But thanks for calling in.
For you, Jacob.
Yeah.
DFARS 7012 does not hard code a version, which is why the class deviation is there. Do you foresee anytime in the near future them updating to hard code some version with that in correspondence with CMMC?
Yes. Yeah. So the question for a long time was, is DFARS 7012 the norm or is it the exception? Because normally in rulemaking, if you're going to impose requirements on people, you have to estimate cost, you have to estimate time, you have to estimate impact, burden, so on and so forth. There's statutes, executive orders, there's tons of regulations around rulemaking. And it's part of the reason why it takes so long is they have to try to estimate all this stuff. If you don't specify a baseline, you can't make the estimate. They didn't do an estimate of time and burden in 2013 when 7012 was created. They didn't do an updated estimate in 2016 when they revised DFARS 7012. They just said, implement whatever version is current at the time of the solicitation, which is very convenient because they don't have to go through rulemaking every time there's an updated revision. That's what everybody wants, right? Well, apparently that's not what everybody wants, because as soon as NIST updates the revision, now you've got different baselines, different systems, different solicitations, this and that. So they issued a class deviation, which essentially overrides the language in the clause. And so I assume that when they go through DFARS 7012 rulemaking to revise it for its third version, they will specify probably Rev 3 at the time, because I don't think we'll be on Rev 4 by the time that happens. So yeah, they're gonna update it in the future to specify the revisions, and hopefully at that time we sync up the revision that CMMC is talking about, the revision that 7012 is talking about. But there's nothing wrong with using class deviations to bridge this gap. I mean, they could do that indefinitely. I will say,
sounds like it'd be a good idea just to keep it generic then.
Yeah, I mean, they could just keep recycling the class deviations, and then they don't have to technically update that language in 7012. But 7012 is due for a revision, and I imagine that's on the list of things that they're going to clarify, like FedRAMP equivalency, in the language of the clause. Now, I will say I would take a little bit of credit, because if you remember back in the day before this class deviation was issued for this Rev 2, Rev 3 thing, we made a lot of noise. We did multiple podcast episodes. I was posting memes about it, posting polls about it. We were talking about it everywhere, going, this is a crisis. If you do not do something about the floating revision number in 7012 and you specify revision 3 in CMMC, it's going to collapse, because you can't show up to assess Rev 3 if you've implemented Rev 2. So I like to think that we raised awareness around this issue and helped to get this class deviation written. So to call back to this whole thing about Canada, we're raising an issue about it because the reciprocity thing needs to get fixed, and there's some evidence that making us think about it can help.
So what do you think the chances are that they do essentially simultaneous revisions of 7012, 32 CFR, 48 CFR, all of them with an interim final rule, all dropping basically at the same time when they update this to Rev 3?
So I think that the Chargers will win the Super Bowl one day. And so I don't know if I am the best person to make a guess about whether that will happen. Is there a universe in the multiverse of universes in which that is a reality? 100%. Is that our universe in this reality? Maybe not. Maybe not. I would love it. It would be incredible to watch the machinery of government synchronize in such a way. It could happen. We're all about efficiency these days, right, everybody? So maybe
efficiency.
Maybe it happens, but I wouldn't take that bet. I wouldn't take that bet. So yeah, there you go. All right, let's see here. Okay, no judgment. There's a lot of people that haven't been following this for several years now. There's a lot of people that are starting from zero, starting from scratch. Totally fine. That's what we're here for. That's why we put this information out for. If you are not aware, CMMC is a DoD program that seeks to verify whether or not defense contractors handling covered, controlled, unclassified DoD data in the process of being under contract with the government, if they have implemented their contractually obligated cybersecurity requirements. If you are handling controlled technical information, unclassified naval nuclear propulsion information, critical safety information, and various other categories of defense unique, controlled, regulated data that is unclassified, pursuant to your contract with the DoD, they are going to require that you pay a company to come in and certify that you have implemented your cybersecurity requirements. They're doing this because for the better part of over a decade now, contractors have had these requirements in their contracts. They've been handling this sensitive, unclassified information, and they haven't been implementing the requirements, and harms have resulted to the department, to weapon systems, to contractors, the taxpayer, on and on and on. They have no assurance that those requirements are being implemented. They have a mountain of evidence that those requirements have not been implemented. So as a result, Congress, the DoD, a bunch of bureaucrats got together, and when a bunch of bureaucrats love each other very much and they all get together, programs like CMMC show up to verify that you have done what you have stated to the government. So the core part of CMMC is requiring external third-party certification assessments. It recently came to my attention that there are defense industry groups who are unaware that the CMMC program involves third-party assessments. And now you are aware.
Well, I mean, Jacob, it just something that we have to keep in mind that, these small businesses are out there. They are trying to do what they do, right? They're not paying attention in large part to, all of the ins and outs of what's going on and regulatory requirements and all the things that we're doing. We've been doing this for a very long time, but this is what we do, right? And so it's something as this ecosystem continues to morph and grow and change, we feel really great about, in the scroller here, we've got 22 clients that have passed, that are CMMC L2, right? There's 22. That's a lot. That's a lot of people that have gone through the assessment so far. We're talking about 80,000 companies that have to do this, right? I mean, we have not even scratched the surface of the surface yet of the number of companies that have to get this done. And so there's going to be lots of people that are just still learning about what these requirements really mean. And that's why, sometimes it feels like we're saying the same thing over and over and over again, but we're saying it over and over and over again precisely because there are so many people that still have not, dialed in to this problem. We've got, 200, 300,000 companies that have to pay attention to this. We've got 80,000 that have to get CMMC L2. We have not, we're doing everything we can to reach the masses, but the masses have not been reached yet.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. And we have, like you said, no problem explaining it as many times as people need in as many formats as you need. Whatever it takes, that's the job. So that's what we're here to do. But yeah, it does involve third-party assessments.
Yeah, it's also very confusing because the way you read the rollout in 32 CFR is like, oh, I can self-attest for a year probably.
Yeah.
Right. And then the DoD drops a memo like 4 weeks ago saying, well, about 60% of you are actually going to have to certify. Right. It's like, and so there is definitely a lot of confusion, which we definitely understand, to Scott and Jacob's point, why you're here and why you're listening and why we kind of keep saying the same things is because there's always like little updates, not maybe massive updates, but just little things going on in the background that could very easily change the trajectory on if you guys have defense business the rest of 2026, or 2025, 2026.
Oh, yeah.
So.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So there you go. All righty. Another basic question that's not technically a CMMC question, but I see coming up more and more. Can I get out of implementing certain requirements in NIST SP 800-171? Yes, you can. This is a current debate. I can't wait until, I hate it when the call ends, but when this call ends, I get to go back on LinkedIn and fight with CISOs and other security types who say that CMMC isn't a risk-based program. First of all, you are a data steward handling DoD's data. So it is not your risk determination about what acceptable risk can be taken with their data. It's a negotiation that you have to go into with someone else's data when you're handling it and making risk decisions about it. So CMMC is just there to verify that you have implemented the baseline that you have agreed to implement in your contract with the government. And like anything, you're free to negotiate the terms of that contract with the government, but not via CMMC. CMMC is happening afterwards. DFARS 252-204-7012 is the clause that says when you're handling this data, you must implement the requirements in NIST SP 800-171 right here in paragraph B2 subparagraph I, everybody's favorite subparagraph in the DFARS. And it says, except as provided above, blah, 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 the covered contractor information system, which is your information system handling DoD data, shall be subject to the requirements in SP 800-171. And you shall implement those no later than December 31st, 2016, because this is a regulation that came out of rulemaking in 2016. And then right down here in this paragraph, it says the contractor shall submit requests to vary from NIST SP 800-171 in writing to the contract officer for consideration by the DoD CIO. The contractor need not implement any security requirement adjudicated by an authorized representative of the DoD CIO to be non-applicable or to have alternative but equally effective security measures that may be implemented in its place. This is a clause in the DFARS 7012 contract clause. In fact, the provision that makes you aware in the solicitation that you will have this clause language is contained in something known as DFARS 252-204-7008. And it has the exact same language. First of all, by submitting a bid on this offer, you are representing that you are implementing the control. So this is where you are self-attesting to complying with the requirements. But if the offerer proposes to vary from any of the requirements specified in SB 800-171 that are in effect at the time of the solicitation, the offerer shall submit to the contracting officer for consideration by the DoD CIO a written explanation of why, what your alternatives are, so on and so forth. That negotiation process, whether they interpret it favorably for you or not, whether they are very conservative in their decisions or not, is outside of the scope of what CMMC then shows up later on to verify that you have implemented. This mechanism has been in DFARS 7012 since 2013. It's still in DFARS 7012 to this day. As we've said before, if you wait until the day that your assessor shows up for CMMC to start negotiating with the C3PAO over your requirements, you are way, way past the due date for having figured out what is going to be applicable or not, what you can do or what you can't do, so on and so forth. It all happens beforehand. So one of the things that commonly gets the finger pointed at CMMC, it's a DFARS 7012 thing.
Yeah. So Jacob, not to get people's hopes up here, how many of these waivers have you heard of being approved since DFARS 7012 went final?
Very few. Very few. It's a very conservative process of getting exceptions and variances from the baseline, specifically because 800-171 has been determined to be the minimum acceptable baseline. The
only ones I've heard of, and maybe it was only once or twice, all had to do with FIPS.
Yeah, and you also have to be able to propose alternative solutions. So one of the common things is writing them and saying we can't afford one of these requirements is not a sufficient basis to not implement the requirement. So it is an uphill battle, but there is a mechanism for doing it. Regardless, there is no mechanism in CMMC because that's not what CMMC is doing. I have talked to people who were former contractors and things like that who used to watch the inbox that you're supposed to email these requests to. And from what I've heard anecdotally over the years since 2016, there's been like a dozen requests they've ever received to vary from the baseline. So I think a lot of people don't even know that a lot of people don't know that this is in their contracts, but they don't know that this mechanism is in there. So yeah, there is a process theoretically for getting around the requirements, but it's a minimum baseline for a reason, and it's not a CMMC function. So if you hear people saying CMMC is not risk-based because I can't have a variable baseline, you got to talk to DFARS or NIST or somebody else. This is a Wendy's.
Not only that, but it's not your risk because it's not your data.
100%. Couldn't have said it better myself.
God, look at you. God.
Couldn't have said it better myself, Scott. And with that, and with that, that is the end of the Q&A for this week. We'll be back next week at Friday, just like always. We got the podcast coming out Thursdays. Daniel's got a podcast that's coming out from time to time as well. We're going to be out and about at various events. We'll be at CS2 Reston in May. We'll be at Seek West in Las Vegas in May. We got Summit 7 Lives coming up in Dallas and Tampa. We got rulemaking that's going to happen. We got a bunch of stuff that's going to happen. Tons of cool content. Oh, that's what I meant to say. We got a brand new version of our shared responsibility matrix. So if you'd like to see what's going on with that, reach out to us and we can provide a copy. We can schedule a call, talk about what's going on. If you don't know what a shared responsibility matrix is, tune in next week and we'll talk about it. But that's an hour. And so thanks for stopping by, everybody. We'll see you next week.
Thanks, guys. Have a good one.